This is Lecture 48B, continuing our discussion of Deng Xiaoping and how he became the de facto leader of China after Mao's death, and what this all means in terms of socialism with Chinese characteristics. We left off with our discussion of the Zunyi Conference, where the Maoists took complete control, and those that weren't Maoists were gone, including the foreign observers, Otto Braun in particular. Zhou Enlai continued as the chairman of the military commission and the de facto generalissimo. Mao Zedong was his number one in charge of operations. Deng Xiaoping was number two in charge of logistics. And Wang Qizang was number three in charge of personnel and intelligence. So they had complete control of the military commission and thus the Long March. Now, to escape Zhong's pursuit, at this point, the direct route to Sichuan had been blocked by the KMT. So First Red Army forces spent the next several months maneuvering to avoid direct confrontation with the enemy. And the new military commission maneuvered the Red Army south and west through Guizhou, Sichuan, and Yunnan, which is the province right on the Vietnamese border. Now, all the time it was feigning attacks on Guiyang and Kunming to disguise the overall aim of the retrograde movement, which was to join up with Zhang Gutao's Fourth Red Army. Now, crossing the Yangtze occurred when the First Red Army on May 9, 1935 escaped the fascist pursuit and did that crossing of the Yangtze River. Now, it still had to deal with dangerous mountain passes at heights of up to 12,500 feet, which is about as high as a lowland Chinese can go without supplementary oxygen. Certainly can't go higher than 14,000 feet. So, in general, there were extraordinarily tough and rough climatic conditions, replacing the fascists as enemy number one. The Red Army had to confront this enemy while suffering through shortages of food, clothing, and equipment, and along the way the Red Army had to deal with hostile tribes of local ethnic groups. The Looting Bridge the Red Army had to cross, and it was one of the many places on mountains and rivers that it had to capture crossings under heavily defended hostile warlord or fascist troop defensive fire. The most famous example was the capture and use of the Looting Bridge. And as I mentioned last time, I think there's a pretty good movie made of that, which is a combination of the actual photographs of the crossing at the time, motion picture photography, and reenactment. But at any rate, ethnic group warlords often refused to take the KMT side during the Civil War, mainly because the prowess of the Red Army struck terror in their breasts, and where the fascist forces, as in the case of the 300 Kampa bandits, that's K-H-A-M-P-A, suborned local warlords, they suffered massive losses. For example, the KMT military command in Sichuan had recruited these Kampa bandits to destabilize the local Han warlord Lu Wenhe. Now, Lu had refused to do battle against the Red Army to save his own force from destruction. Another example being the First Red Army clash with Kham rebels in the 1934 Khamba Rebellion, that's K-H-A-M-B-A, themselves on the run from Royal Tibetan forces. Now, Mao's First Red Army traversed several swamps while under attack by what was called the Muslim Hui Ma clique. He called it a clique because Ma and his two sons ran the whole thing. Muslim Ma's forces were commanded by his kinfolk, Generals Ma Bufang and Ma Buqing. Now, in summary, all these ethnic suckers the fascist forces were able to recruit to do battle with the Red Army were defeated and completely destroyed. Beating the Fourth Red Army, Zhang learns the hard way. Now, in June and July of 1935, the First Red Army met with the Fourth Red Army at Linkeku, and Zhang Gutao had commanded that Fourth Red Army through its retrograde from Henan. And he arrived with 84,000 troops in excellent condition. And he wanted one of his own generals, Chen Chang-hao, to take over Zhou Enlai's position as generalissimo of the entire Red Army, that is, chairman of the military commission. And he himself wanted to replace Chu Te on the military commission. However, on July 18, 1935, the First Red Army Military Commission agreed in principle for Zhou Enlai to relinquish his position as Generalissimo, or chairman of the military commission, and for several leading positions to be handed generals of the Fourth Red Army, but in practice these changes never got through the talking stage because Deng disagreed with Mao on the next phase of the Long March. Now Mao insisted that the Long March go north to Shanxi. Deng insisted on going southwest. So the two armies each went their separate ways for the moment. However, Zhang Gutao's Fourth Red Army's course to the south and west did not work out for him, and he eventually headed north. Now, by didn't work out, I mean that on his southern and western course, Zhang's armies were largely destroyed, initially by the forces of Chiang Kaishek, and then by Chiang's Chinese Ma clique Muslim allies, the same ones that Mao had whipped hand-to-hand. Zhang's troops could not. The defeated remnants of his Fourth Red Army were able to avoid annihilation and succeeded in rejoining elements of the Second Red Army. So together, the Fourth and Second Red Armies linked up with Mao's First Red Army forces in Shanxi at Yan'an. Zhang was the kind of commander that has to learn the hard way. And as usual, it's his soldiers that are going to pay the price. Now let's take a quick look at the history of the Second Red Army. The Second Red Army began its own retrograde movement aiming west from Hubei in November 1935. It was commanded by He Long, and He Long had an interesting history in that he had originally commanded the KMT 20th Army in 1923. Then he joined the Communist Party of China. And in reprisal, the Shanghai Green gangster, the fascist thug Chiang Kaishek, had He Long's relatives executed, including 3 of his sisters and a brother. In 1932, He Long has helped establish the first Jiangxi Soviet in the Hunan-Jiangxi border area, and in August of 1934, he received command of the Second Red Army with its home base in Hubei. Now, to assist in preparing for its retrograde movement, the First Red Army sent the 6th Group to He Long in Hubei 2 months before the march kicked off. The 6th Group was commanded by Xiao Qi. Xiao Qi's forces, along with He Long's Second Red Army, combined forces in the event, and on November 19, 1935, Xiao Qi's 6th Group and He Long's Second Red Army set out on their own long march. However, after the kickoff, He Long and Xiao Qi lost communication with the First Red Army. Now, he and Qi's merged forces were now simply the Second Red Army, and it fought its way further west than the First Red Army. It traveled all the way to Lijiang in Yunnan Province, which is the province bordering on North Vietnam, and it then crossed the Jade Dragon Snow Mountain and marched through the Tibetan highlands of West Sichuan. It's interesting to note that there were many women on this march, including leading women. He Long and Xiao Qi were married to sisters, and these women also accompanied the army. He Long's wife, Jian Zhenren, carried her baby daughter she had given birth to 3 weeks before their march, and Jian Zhenfu gave birth to a son in the swamps of North Sichuan. There were foreign detainees and guests involved by this time. Forces of the Second Red Army detained 2 European missionaries, Rudolf Bosshardt and Arnoldus Heymann, for 16 months. Bosshardt later related his account of the details of daily life on the Long March in a book, and Edgar Snow traveled to Yan'an and became a guest of the First Red Army, writing a book which quickly became an international bestseller called Red Star over China. Now we have the union of the 3 armies finally on October 22nd, 1935, and this marks the end of the Long March. On October 22nd, 1935, Mao's army, that's the First Red Army, reached Shanxi province and joined with local communist forces there. Now this is an important point. There were already local communist forces in place, and they had been for quite a while. This was a preparatory step that had been taken way back in the months preceding the final decision to go on the Long March. Local commissars were Liu Zidan, Gao Gang, and Zhu Haidong, and they had built an excellent Soviet base in northern Shanxi. This proves that Mao had foreseen all the details of the Long March long before the party as a whole had accepted the concept. Now, Zhang's Fourth Red Army, what was left of it, rejoined Mao in Shanxi. Then, after marching almost a full year, the Second Red Army reached Bao'an in Shanxi on October 22, 1935, and the three armies were united. It was finally the end of the Long March. The Red Army Logistics Department under Deng Xiaoping, that is what we would call G4, built an arsenal of weapons confiscated from whipped local warlords. Its Operation Department, G1, under Mao Zedong, confiscated property from landlords. Its Personnel Department under Wang, G3, recruited peasants and the poor, and in this was assisted at every step by the Intelligence Department, or G2. Now, along the way, some 50,000 troops and civilians were planted for the future. Some 8,000 troops of the original 100,000 soldiers in Mao's First Army ultimately made it to the final destination of Yan'an in 1935. Fatigue, hunger, cold, and sickness, not to mention military casualties, left their mark. Plus, they left 50,000 troops and civilians in healthy condition along the way in different villages and provinces. Now, the new command looked a little bit different than the old one, so 1 month later in November 1935, shortly after settling in northern Shanxi, Mao officially took over Zhou Enlai's generalissimo position in the Red Army, becoming chairman of the Military Commission. Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping became vice chairman. Zhang Gutao made a complete self-criticism and was made deputy to Deng. Now, from this time forward, Mao Zedong was the preeminent leader of the Communist Party of China. Zhou was his number one, Deng Xiaoping number two. Both Mao and Zhou would retain their positions till their deaths in 1976. So I think you're beginning to see why Deng Xiaoping was the man who took over in 1978. Aftermath, the Red Star over China. While costly, the Long March gave the Communist Party of China, CPC, the isolated Yan'an locale it needed to rebuild while avoiding the attacks of Japanese and German-backed Chiang Kaishek's fascist KMT. The Red Army recuperated and rebuilt in the wilderness of northern China. Yan'an was vital in helping the CPC prove itself to a new group of oppressed farmers, and the determination and dedication of the arriving Long Marchers did this job. In 1935, about this, Mao wrote, "The Long Army is a manifesto. It has proclaimed to the world that the Red Army is an army of heroes, while the imperialists and their running dogs, Chiang Kaishek and his like, are impotent. It has proclaimed their utter failure to encircle, pursue, obstruct, and intercept us. The Long March is also a propaganda force. It has announced to some 200 million people in 11 provinces along our road that the road of the Red Army is their only road to liberation." Mao issued his 8 points of attention, instructing the army to avoid harm to or disrespect of the farmers, in spite of the soldiers' desperate need for food and supplies, and this policy won unending support for the communists among the rural masses. Now, from militia to regular forces. During these years, the Chinese Communist Party persevered and strengthened its influence. The Red Army fought a disciplined and organized guerrilla campaign against superior Japanese forces, allowing it to gain experience, and as it did, it trained regular army forces in the rear safe haven. Soon Red regulars would be able to go toe-to-toe against Chiang's best and Japan's undefeated regulars, forcing the KMT into nominal anti-Japanese alliance. The Reds were able to force a nominal alliance with Chiang Kaishek and the KMT during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 until 1945. It was not an easy task because Chiang was a dyed-in-the-wool ideological fascist. However, elements of the KMT army were patriotic, and they made Chiang agree to Mao's overtures, and by dividing the patriotic elements away from the fascists, the communists would conquer. The agitation for a joint anti-Japanese war had begun with Japan's invasion and occupation of Manchuria, which was not opposed by Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT. He had been a Japanese comprador all of his life. The Shanghai Green Gang, where Chiang's primary loyalty always lay, knew that they could make lots of money with the Japanese fascists. They had always done so, as the Japanese ruling clique had been a partner in their opium rackets, and the Japanese ruling families were more than happy for Chiang and the Green Gang to run the opium trade out of Shanghai in exchange for a piece of that action. This is an old story in the opium business and continues to this very day, where the U.S. Armed Forces and CIA are the biggest partners of the Afghan opium drug lords. But at any rate, Chiang and his boss, Big-Eared Du, knew that their real enemy was the Communist Party of China. The CPC was the great threat to them, as it wanted to change the entire way of life of the servitude epoch. They agitated for a rebirth of the primitive communist order on a new and highly advanced social base of capitalism converted to socialism. Chiang's Achilles heel was of his own creation. Now, accordingly, Chiang and the KMT refused to ally with the Reds to fight against the Imperial Japanese Army. Chiang preferred to wipe out domestic communists who would end his business rather than engage in a turf war with foreign gangsters. These Japanese ruling family gangsters just wanted to muscle up their piece. Now, Chiang's problem was that he'd been preaching a patriotic fascism to his officers, and as often as not, these officers were of that patriotic persuasion. So Chiang's Achilles heel was of his own creation. The CPC knew that to finish him, all they needed to do was focus the anger of the Chinese masses against the brutal Japanese invasion of China. So we have the 1936 Xi'an Incident, Xian, which forced Chiang into alliance with the Reds. Now, Chiang's policy of appeasement and outright collaboration with the Japanese led him to order KMT generals Zhang Zulang and Yang Hucheng to carry out a campaign against the CPC. However, their provincial armies had already suffered significant casualties in battle with the Red Army. So disgruntled, these two generals turned against their boss, and on December 12, 1936, General Zhang and Yang kidnapped Chiang at Xi'an and forced him into a truce with the CPC. The incident became known as the Xi'an Incident. Zhou Enlai flew to Xi'an from the communist base area at Yan'an and negotiated with Chiang personally. The upshot? Both parties suspended fighting to form a second united front to focus their energies in fighting against the Japanese. Now, the Reds know Chiang is not sincere, but at any rate, Chiang's fallback idea was that the alliance he had been forced into would be in name only. However, by 1937, Nippon's bosses had had enough of Chiang's new face, and Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China. Tokyo's well-equipped and certainly better disciplined troops easily overran KMT defenders in northern and coastal China, and the fascist army of the KMT by this time was primarily an assortment of thugs bossing around a lot of freeloaders who had joined for 3 hots and a cot. The few sincere anti-Japanese fighters could be isolated and worked with by Red Army commanders, and they did so. Now, meanwhile, the Red Army of the CPC had shunned unnecessary conventional warfare, fighting guerrilla style and preserving their forces. But all the time, they were training regular units for face-to-face battle with Chiang's regulars and Japan's finest. In other words, as we have seen, the first lesson of the Long March had been to avoid face-to-face militia encounters with KMT regulars, had it not. So the CPC Red Army engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. True enough, the time would come when the CPC would have to stand up a conventional regular army. But first they knew they had to deal with what they had built in Yan'an, and in a phrase, what they had was a glorified militia army, and they knew it. In the years since 1935, however, the Red Army had developed 2 regular field armies, and now they were going to need them. So to summarize, the level of actual cooperation and coordination between the CPC and KMT during World War II was at best minimal, because Chiang would rather act the Japanese pompadour and get paid for it. The Japanese were happy to trade cash for land, and thus paid Chiang to withdraw from engagements rather than to act in a patriotic manner, and it had been left to the communists to fight the Japanese, and they took up the gauntlet. Now in 1937 there was a full-scale Japanese invasion of China that began on July 7th. Chinese and Japanese troops exchanged fire in the vicinity of the Marco Polo Bridge, which was a crucial access route to Beijing, and a full-scale battle developed as Japanese invading troops took Beijing and its port city of Tianjin. On July 29, 1937, some 5,000 troops of the 1st and 2nd Corps of Chiang's East Hopei Army mutinied, turning against Chiang and attacking the Japanese garrison on their own initiative. The Japanese military ostensibly protected some 260 Japanese civilians living in Tongzhou in accordance with the Boxer Protocol of 1901. Now, that disgraceful treaty signed by the Chinese imperial regime after Japan invaded China during the Boxer Rebellion. The Japanese had engaged in atrocities and massacres against civilians and burned Beijing, suppressing that rebellion. The Marco Polo Bridge incident was the beginning of a new Sino-Japanese war, and Chiang Kaishek announced a change in KMT policy of non-resistance against Japan at Lushan on July 10, 1937, 3 days after the Marco Polo Bridge incidents. However, the communists were already fighting Japan, and Chiang's announcement was just propaganda. He wasn't going to do anything. Now, in the Battle of Shanghai, August through November of 1937, it began on August 12th, and Chiang Kai-shek mobilized his army and air force under his direct command and laid siege to the Japanese area of Shanghai International Settlement, where 30,000 Japanese civilians lived with 30,000 soldiers. Now, on the 13th of August 1937, KMT soldiers and warplanes attacked Japanese Marines in Shanghai, leading to the Battle of Shanghai. And on August 14th, KMT planes bombed the Shanghai International Settlement. Japanese planes bombed Shanghai from the 14th through the 16th of August 1937, and the Imperial Japanese Navy sent many sorties of then-advanced long-range G-3M medium-heavy land-based bombers and assorted carrier-based aircraft against the KMT Air Force. Patriotic Chinese pilots fought an effective resistance with their Hawk 3 and P-26-28 Pea-shooter fighter squadrons. The Japanese took heavy 50% losses from the defending Chinese pilots, and the KMT accordingly designated August 14th as their China Air Force Day. As in Spain, the skies of China had become a testing zone for combat aircraft designs of both fascism and defending republicanism. But a big difference was that the Chinese did not have Soviet support, as the KMT had been fighting against the communists for many years, whereas the Republicans in Spain did have Soviet support, and we've gone through all of that before. Now, thus, the Japanese introduction of their advanced A-5M fighters into the Shanghai Nanking Theater of Operations beginning on September 18th of 1937 gave them what they hoped would be air superiority, but a few experienced Chinese veteran pilots in their older and slower biplanes proved more than able to hold their own against the sleek A-5Ms in dogfights, so the Battle of Shanghai turned into a battle of attrition against the Chinese Air Force, and at the start of the battle, the local strength of Chiang's KMT army was around 5 divisions, each of about 14,000 officers and men, or about 70,000 troops. Local Japanese forces comprised about 6,300 Marines, and on August 23rd, Japanese Army reinforcements succeeded in landing in northern Shanghai 200,000 troops, and 6,300 Japanese Marines joined them who were already there. Now, Japan invaded with numerous naval vessels and aircraft, and after more than 3 months of intense fighting, on October 26th, the Japanese army finally captured Dechangzhen, an important strongpoint within Shanghai. And on November 5th, additional reinforcements from Japan landed on Hangzhou Bay. Finally, on November 9th, 1937, Chiang Kai-shek ordered a general retreat of his forces. Now we talk about the rape and massacre of Nanking. Building on the hard-won victory in Shanghai, the Imperial Japanese Army captured the KMT capital city of Nanking in December of 1937 and northern Shanxi in September, in November of 1937. But to do this, the Japanese had to commit 350,000 soldiers. Between December 13, 1937 and January 30th, 1938, Japanese forces tortured and murdered 300,000 Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers, and along the way the Imperial Army ordered the rapes of tens of thousands of women after the fall of Nanking. Today the Japanese government denies that this happened, and of course it's a big point of contention between the PRC and Tokyo. At any rate, in 1938 there was failure and genocide. At the start of 1938, the leadership in Tokyo still hoped to consolidate those areas it controlled in Shanghai, Nanjing, and northern China into one overseas protectorate. However, the patriotic KMT resistance and the communist guerrilla units made this impossible. Therefore, the Japanese escalated the war in Jiangsu in an attempt to wipe out Chinese resistance, but were defeated at the Battle of Taizhang in March and April of '38. And following this defeat, the Japanese General Staff realized that they had to wipe out Wuhan, and they changed their strategy. The Communists had de facto control over Wuhan militarily, and the Japanese had been stopped cold. The Imperial General Staff deployed almost all of its existing armies in China to attack the city of Wuhan, and the Japanese captured Wuhan on October 27, 1938, forcing the KMT to retreat to Chongqing, where Chiang Kaishek continued to play a double game, saying he would consider a truce if Japan agreed to withdraw to the pre-1937 borders. The communist units and their working class support evacuated the city and melted into the countryside as usual. With Japanese casualties and costs mounting, the Imperial General Headquarters was in serious trouble. Japan's ruling cap families wanted to stop the financial bleeding. Accordingly, the Imperial General Headquarters attempted to break Chinese resistance by ordering the air branches of their Navy and Army to launch massive air raids on civilian targets. Japanese raiders hit the KMT's new capital at Chongqing and many other major cities in unoccupied China, and this genocidal attack left millions of Chinese civilians dead, injured, and hopeless. In 1939-40, there is a Chinese counterattack and stalemate. Now, the beginning of 1939 witnessed the war entering a new phase with the unprecedented defeat of the Japanese by the Communists at Sichuan, Zhaoyang, Changsha, and Guangxi. Now, these outcomes encouraged the KMT to launch its first counteroffensive against the invaders in early 1940. The KMT's low military-industrial capacity and the limited experience in modern warfare that it had led to its defeat. Afterwards, Chiang would not risk offensive campaigns given the miserable condition of his armies and opposition to his leadership both within the KMT and among the Chinese people. He needed his troops intact for urban pacification. However, there had been obvious victories for patriotic Chinese. Hui forces in Sichuan under Generals Ma Hongbin and Ma Buqing routed the Japanese army and their puppet Inner Mongol forces, and in so doing they prevented the planned Japanese advance into northwest China. General Ma Biao led Hui, Solar, and Dongzhang Muslim cavalry. Now, the 100 Regiments Offensive is the next big event. Now, this 100 Regiments Offensive went on between the 20th of August and the 5th of December of 1940, and it was a major campaign of the Communist Party of China's National Revolutionary Army divisions, commanded by General Peng Dehuai, against the Imperial Japanese Army in central China. Now, the battle had long been the focus of propaganda, has long been the focus of propaganda in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, but to summarize it, in 1939-1940, the Japanese launched more than 109 small campaigns involving around 1,000 combatants each, and 10 large campaigns of 10,000 men each to wipe out communist guerrillas in the Hebei and Shandong plains. And in addition, Wang Jinghui's puppet government had its offensive against the CPC guerrillas. By 1940, the rebuilt Red Army was impressive. The extraordinary success and expansion of the 8th Route Army against the Japanese had Chu Te and the rest of the military leadership ready to engage the Japanese army to win, and not just hold their own. Lin Piao, Mao, Deng, and Zhu decided to give one of their best generals, the aforestated Bang De-Wai, command of this greatest anti-Japanese operation the Red Army had ever mounted. On the eve of the battle, the communist forces grew to 400,000 men strong in 105 regiments. Chu De and Peng De-Wai ordered a coordinated offensive by most of their regulars, 46 regiments. They picked those with the highest ratings by their political officers. Accordingly, from the 115th Division they took 46 regiments, 47th more from the 129th Division, and 22 regiments from the 120th Division. The offensive was against Japanese garrisons in cities that the Nipponese considered pacified, and against the railway lines linking them. The offensive kicked off on August 20th, 1940, and continued through the 10th of September, 1940. The Communist forces also attacked railway lines that separated their base areas. Now, this geographical objective was to link the base areas from Dijon to Shizang in Hubei, Shizang to Taiwan in central Shanxi, and Taiyan to Datong in northern Shanxi. Peng's order of battle consisted of 80 regiments attacking on 22 August, and 25 more in reserve. The Red Army offensive succeeded in blowing up bridges and tunnels, ripping up track, and went on to attack Japanese garrisons frontally. About 600 miles of railway were destroyed, and the Jingxing coal mine was completely destroyed. That mine was important to the Japanese war industry, and it would be completely unusable by them for at least 6 months. The offensive achieved the greatest victory the CPC fought and won during the entire war. It made Peng into a new national hero, and he became chief of the People's Liberation Army from 1954 through 1959. At any rate, on December 5, 1940, the 8th Route Army issued 2 final reports. Each of these gives somewhat different figures, but one of these detailed the dead and wounded casualties of the Japanese at 12,645, 5,153 of their puppet troops, 281 Japanese prisoners of war, and 1,407 puppet troop POWs, 7 Japanese and 1,845 puppet troops defected, and 293 strong points were taken. There's a second report with somewhat different figures, which I mentioned. But at any rate, in a 2010, a Chinese article by Pan Zekin emerged to say the combat losses or successes result should be more than 50,000. By all accounts, the Japanese took terrific losses. The Red Army recorded about 600 miles of railway and 1,000 miles of road blown up and sabotaged, along with 213 bridges and 11 tunnels and 37 train stations destroyed. The damage regarding communication systems are 1,333 cut down and 1,107 capsized cable posts, and up to 150 miles of long cable cut, and of course the Jiangxing coal mine stopped operating altogether. Now, this leads to the Three Alls campaign. From October to December 1940, the Japanese responded in force, reasserting control of railway lines wherever they could and conducting aggressive mopping up operations in the rural areas around them. Now, the Japanese General Staff then sent General Rasuji Okamura to take command of the North China Area Army in the summer of 1941. And his orders were to implement a new strategy called the Three Alls. This meant kill all, burn all, and destroy all. The CBC Military Commission had debated over how directly to confront the Japanese since at least the Lushan Conference in August of 1937. Some thought about the magnitude of communist losses to the well-equipped Japanese. In the event, the 100 Regiments Offensive triggered the Three Alls campaign of the aggressors. So while it killed 22 million people, the Japanese killed 22 million people, these were civilians. And the Red Army suffered relatively few losses. In fact, the genocide forced these the remnants of millions into the safety of the Red base areas, where they went right to work farming. Now, this mass influx promoted a tremendous increase of the number of volunteers enlisting in the Red Army. So on balance, the 100 Regiments assault and the Japanese 3-All's response gave the Red Army everything it needed in terms of agricultural produce to field a massively increasing People's Liberation Army. It only remained to arm them. And that would happen when the USSR entered the war against Japan and the Soviet Red Army turned over all of the captured weaponry to the Mao's Red Army forces in 1945. So after 1940, the Japanese encountered tremendous difficulties in administering and garrisoning their seized territories. Their friendly puppet governments, most prominently the Nanking government, headed by former KMT Premier Wang Jingwei, were disobedient. Atrocities committed by the Japanese army left the puppets very unpopular. The Japanese had to settle for a large, collaborationist Chinese army police force to maintain public order. And by 1941, the Red Army had Japan contained to the eastern coastal areas of China. Here they were constantly harassed by communist guerrillas, and Japan was suffering increasingly higher casualties. It could not make any progress. In 1942, U.S. observers, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, and his commander, the President's son, James Roosevelt, told Joint Chief General George Marshall that the issue of Japan staying in China was in doubt, thanks to the communists. So to recap, there were two periods of Chinese resistance. The first period began on July 9, 1937 with the Battle of the Marco Polo Bridge and lasted through October 25, 1938 with the fall of Wuhan. Fascist China had been unprepared for total war with Japan. Chiang had been occupied fighting against his own people, saying, quote, "The Japanese are a disease of the skin. The communists are a disease of the heart," unquote. The Second United Front between the KMT and CPC was never truly implemented, as Chiang never intended to implement it. But Chiang realized that to defraud money from the United States and other foreign nations, he had to act as if he was fighting. Thus he pretended to make a stand at Shanghai, using the best of his German-trained divisions. Shanghai was still China's largest and most industrialized city, despite the April 1927 massacre of its working class and the communists there, and the communists still there were able to put steel into patriotic KMT units that he had sent. And as we have seen, the battle for Shanghai lasted over 3 months, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese invaders. When Chiang thought he had done as much as he needed to do to get more money from the, quote, stupid Americans, unquote, he ordered his units into a retreat toward Nanjing. Now, despite Chiang's ulterior motive, the communists had been able to turn the battle into an enormous morale booster for the Chinese people. Now, afterwards, Chiang pitched the Americans and their allies that he had a strategy of trading space for time. The Chinese KMT army, he said, would put up fights to delay the Japanese advance to northern and eastern cities, allowing the home front with its professionals and key industries to retreat west into Chongqing. Now, because of Chiang's scorched earth strategy, dams and levees were intentionally sabotaged to create massive flooding. But the real target was the civilian base of the communist guerrillas, the real target of this flooding. Despite this scorched earth policy, and not because of it, Japanese advances began to stall in late 1938. Now, FDR was not taken in by Chiang's lies, and he sent his own representative to see the patriotic KMT Chinese and the communists at Yan'an. Now, there was the second period from October 25, 1938, when Wuhan fell, until December 1941, when the United States declared war on Japan. The main patriotic Chinese objective in that period was to drag out the war for as long as possible. In this way, the patriotic KMT generals hoped to exhaust Japanese resources while building up their own military capacity. FDR put General Joseph Stilwell in charge, and Stilwell called this strategy winning by outlasting. The KMT army adopted the concept of magnetic warfare to attract advancing Japanese troops to definite points where they were subjected to ambush, flanking attacks, and encirclements in major engagements. And the most prominent example of this tactic was the successful defense of Changsha in 1939. Another example was the 100 Regiments Offensive of September 1940, and still another, the Red Army Continuing Offensive in 1941. In all of these, the cost of securing slave labor in China and its natural resources were becoming unbearable, not to mention the effect on the Japanese army, where heavy casualties were being inflicted on Japan's invading troops. So we had another genocide. Japan's three-all policy. Communist and patriotic KMT units continued their resistance in occupied areas with guerrilla attacks, supporting even larger scale offensives from time to time. And in 1940, the Chinese Red Army launched a major offensive in North China, as we have seen, destroying railways and a major coal mine. These constant harassment and sabotage operations deeply frustrated the Japanese army, and in response, the Imperial General Staff decided to go back to genocide once again, and they announced the Three Alls policy: kill all, loot all, burn all. And it was during this period that another 25 million Chinese civilians were murdered. In 1941, it had seen the Reds contain Japan, however, to north coastal China. The KMT retreated to the western interior. The Communists expanded from Yan'an to their newly linked base areas in Shanxi, and the Red Army guerrilla forces controlled the vast northern countryside of China, and there they did as they wished. In occupied areas, Japanese control was limited to railroads and major cities. They did not have a major military or administrative presence in the vast Chinese countryside, where Chinese guerrillas roamed freely. Japan's victory was impossible, and Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson and the President's son, James Roosevelt, told Joint Chiefs Boss Marshall exactly this after Carlson's last visit to see Mao Zedong. Now, within a few days of the 7th of December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, Chiang joined the Allies and formally declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. So 1942 opened with the English-speaking world and the USSR in alliance in World War against the fascist bloc, including Japan. The Chinese Communists, of course, were already at war with all of them. Now, the Battle of Changsha was fought from Christmas Eve 1941 through 15th of January 42 between Japanese invaders and patriotic Chinese soldiers. I'm going to skip over this discussion. It's in detail in all of your books, but it led to a major split between General Stilwell and Chiang Kaishek. Now, Stilwell was as reactionary as they get in U.S. politics, but he was an honest man, and he recognized a thief like Chiang Kaishek when he saw him. So what Stilwell wanted was complete command of Chiang's armies, and of course Chiang wouldn't let that happen because he knew that Chiang would go into a war that would cost him money that he would otherwise get. So this struggle between Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek went on through this period, and I go into some of the details of it around the battle for Changsha, but I'm not going to go over them here because I think you've got the point. Now, Chiang Kai-shek continued to receive supplies from the U.S., however, through most of the war. Through most of the war, however, the sea routes to China and the Yunnan-Vietnam Railway were closed. Therefore, between the closing of the Burma Road in 1942 and its reopening as the Lido Road in 1945, foreign aid was largely limited to what could be flown in over the hump. Now, Chiang really didn't care because what he wanted was cash, and such relatively easily shipped packages could easily make it to him. Just an earlier version of sending an airplane to someplace like Kabul or Baghdad or Kiev with shrink-wrapped $100 U.S. $100 bills, except that in those days this was real money. On the 16th of April 1942 in Burma, 7,000 British soldiers were encircled by the Japanese 33rd Division during the Battle of Yan'an, and the Chinese 38th Division rescued them. After the Doolittle raid against Tokyo in 1942, the Japanese army conducted a massive sweep through Zhejiang and Jiangxi of northern China, searching to kill the surviving American airmen. In retaliation against Chinese civilians who aided them, the Imperial Japanese Army left behind a trail of devastation, including germ warfare, spreading cholera, typhoid, plague, and dysentery pathogens, causing the death of 250,000 civilians. In 1943, despite the severe shortage of materiel, the Chinese were successful in repelling major Japanese offensives in Hubei and Changde. Now, I discussed this fight between Chiang and Joe Stilwell a little more. Chiang was named Allied Commander-in-Chief in the China Theater in 1942. American General Joseph Stilwell served for a time as Chiang's Chief of Staff while simultaneously commanding American forces in the China-Burma Indian Theater. Now, relations between Stilwell and Chiang soon broke down due to the corruption and inefficiency of the KMT government. Stilwell wanted Chiang to pursue an aggressive strategy, but Chiang's interest was the same as it had been all his life, making money. Thus, he preferred a less expensive strategy of outwitting the Japanese and its concomitant more money for himself. Therefore, Chiang continued to maintain his passive defensive posture, despite Allied pleas to actively break the Japanese blockade. The U.S. and other allies soon lost confidence in Chiang's desire to conduct offensive operations, but they were stuck with him. Stilwell wanted to arm the communists, and he did, but the Red Army needed far more heavy equipment than the U.S. could get to them. So the U.S. had no choice but to concentrate its efforts against the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean area and the Southwest Pacific area, employing an island-hopping strategy. Chiang's long con. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was reluctant to devote British troops, many of whom had been routed by the Japanese in earlier campaigns, to the reopening of the Burma Road. And Stilwell, on the other hand, believed that reopening the road was vital, as all of the ports of China were under Japanese control. The British insisted that China send more troops to Indochina for use in the Burma campaign, but Chiang saw that as an attempt to shift the costs to him. Now, naturally, he was against anything that would cost him money out of his very personal pocket, and Chiang wanted his crack army divisions shifted from Burma to eastern China. Why? Because defending U.S. air bases put him in a better position to extort the, quote, dumb Americans, unquote. Number one dummy being the American General Claire Lee Chennault, who Chiang easily conned. Stilwell knew Chiang very well by now and was strongly opposed to this military farce. American and Canadian overseas Chinese had been recruited by Japanese intelligence to act as covert operatives in Japanese-occupied China, where they could employ their racial background as a disguise, their mandate being to blend in with the local citizenry and wage a campaign of sabotage against patriotic Chinese KMT and communist guerrilla units. And these resistance fighters focused on destruction. The Chinese resistance fighters focused on destruction of Japanese transportation of supplies, signaling bombers, the destruction of railroads and bridges, and they had done a great deal of damage. So in November 1943, Chinese forces invaded northern Burma, encircling Japanese troops in the Mayat Kina and captured Mount Song. The United States saw the Chinese theater as a means to tie up a large number of Japanese troops and as a location for American air bases from which to strike the Japanese home islands. In 1944, with the Japanese position in the Pacific deteriorating rapidly, the Japanese General Staff mobilized over 400,000 men and launched Operation Ichigo, their largest offensive of the Burma theater, attacking the railway between Manchuria and Vietnam, but it failed and they had to withdraw. Along the way, the Japanese brought major cities, and by the way, at that time, Joe Stilwell was so disgusted at the way Chiang was operating that he writes in his memoirs that he told FDR that the best thing he could do would be to order him to shoot Chiang Kaishek and all of his generals. But at any rate, along the way, the Japanese brought major cities of Hunan, Henan, and Guangxi under Japanese occupation because, as usual, Chiang did not defend them. Stilwell recognized Chiang's sabotage and tried to gain overall command of the Chinese army, and Chiang was able to get the Americans to side with him, and in the showdown, Stilwell was replaced by Major General Albert Cody Wedemeyer, who was kind of your typical graduate of West Point, and he wasn't going to do anything he didn't have to do. Now, I want to just do a quick flashback here. By the end of '44, Chinese troops under the command of Sun Li-jen were attacking from India, and those under Wei Li Hung were attacking from Yunnan, and they then joined forces in Mongyu, successfully driving the Japanese out of northern Burma and securing the Lido Road, and the Lido Road was now China's vital supply artery, replacing the hump, so they wouldn't have to do all those flights anymore. In April 1945, Chiang's KMT opium trafficking units launched offensives retaking Hunan and Guangxi. For this kind of money, the KMT soldiers would fight, as would their boss, Chiang Kaishek. Wedemeyer, being an archetypical dumb American, missed all this and planned to launch Operation Carbonado in the summer of 1945 to retake Guangdong. That would give the U.S. a coastal port. That's Canton. From there, he planned to drive north to Shanghai. However, the August 45 atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria hastened Japanese surrender, and Wedemeyer's dream evaporated, and so. I then do a little flashback here and go back over what had been happening through all of this period of time. Just to take a look at the post-World War II intentions of the contestants. The USA and the USSR efforts, they made efforts for a temporary superficial peace between the Reds and Chiang's fascists. It lasted till 1943 when Chiang attacked the CPC with the propaganda declaration China's Destiny. This was Chiang's declaration of war for the post-Japanese defeat period. The Reds answered in kind with their own declaration for what they called New China. Both leaders knew that a final deadly battle was about to begin, and the way World War II developed globally was to the advantage of the CPC. Its guerrilla war tactics had won them popular support within the Japanese occupied areas. Under assault by the genocide of Japan's Three Alls campaign. On the other hand, the KMT's collaboration with the main Japanese campaigns to take over the country proved costly to Chiang Kaishek and his unfortunate troops, and in 1944 Japan launched its last major offensive, Operation Ichigo. Now, just a few comments I want to make about all of this to wrap up this World War II experience of Deng Xiaoping, and that is that Joe Stilwell got pulled out of there at the last minute because FDR was afraid that Chiang was going to make a deal with the Japs to surrender independently. And he didn't want that to happen, and so the price he had to pay was to bring Stilwell back. The first time I ran into anything that had to do with Stilwell was when I joined the Army in 1959, because Stilwell was a soldier, and he had built a big soldiers club at Fort Ord, which is where I went for basic training in 1959. And in 1943, when it was completed, it was the only soldiers club in the entire U.S. Army. Officers, of course, had their clubs, but regular soldiers did not until Stilwell built that place. And I remember going over there once or twice. I was too young to drink, so there was hardly any point in going there as far as I was concerned, but it was a pretty fancy place, and it gave me the false impression that U.S. soldiers were going to be treated this way all around the world. But at any rate, that's something that Stilwell did that I'll never forget. He died in 1946 from the Presidio in San Francisco of stomach cancer, and so he didn't have much longer to live, but he did command the last phase of the U.S. attack on Okinawa, the Battle of Okinawa. And after that, he went on to command another, I think, the 6th Army, and that's how he got, I guess, to be at Fort Ord. Anyway, that pretty well finishes up the Stilwell-Chiang story. Now, after Japan's defeat in World War II, Deng Xiaoping traveled to Chongqing, the city in which Chiang Kaishek had established his fascist regime headquarters during the Japanese invasion, to participate in peace talks between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. The results of these negotiations were negative, and military confrontation between the two antagonists resumed shortly. So immediately after the war with Japan was over, Chiang and the Communists went back to open warfare, and there was nothing that anybody could do about it. I mean, Stilwell had tried to prevent that, so had Zhou Enlai and so on, but it wasn't going to happen. Chiang Kai-shek had to pretend like he was fighting communism as soon as Truman came in, to keep the money going. So there was a lot of double games going at that time. When Harry Truman was in a pissed off mood about 5 years later, he mentioned that Chiang Kaishek had stolen at least $20 billion from the United States in the period from 1945 to 1950, and here 1949, and he was pissed off about that. But anyway, that was back when $1 billion was $1 billion. So Chiang finally really made a lot of money. In those days, in his late 40s, early 50s, my father was a Republican politician in Idaho, and this business was a standard discussion around the dinner table every night, which I listened to, discussion between my parents, I should say. And I remember that the biggest thing at that time was that Chiang Kai-shek had made an alliance with Henry Luce, who owned Time and Life, and that was a big media empire of that time. And the reason he wrote that book about that speech about China's destiny, was so that Henry Luce could use it to propagandize and present Chiang Kai-shek and his wife and his whole fucking family in the totally dishonest way that he had of doing that. And at the same time, by 1948, Chiang had bought himself a U.S. senator for an unheard of amount of cash. Since I'm uncertain of the amount, I've heard different numbers, somewhere between 20 and 50 million U.S. dollars, went to Senator William Noland. Again, one of these plane load things full of cash. And Noland headed up what was called the China lobby in Congress, especially in the Senate. And Chiang Kai-shek could do no wrong in that period of time. And of course, it's from this same period that Nixon emerged, and he made Mao Zedong his #1 enemy. But at any rate, as we've seen, Deng Xiaoping in this final phase of the war, 1945 to 49, was political commissar of the 2nd Field Army, commanded by Liu Bochang, and in this capacity, Deng disseminated the ideas of Mao Zedong, which were now the ideological foundations of the Communist Party. His political and ideological work, along with his status as a veteran of the Long March, placed him in a privileged position within the party to occupy positions of power in the Communist Party thenceforward. The party finally won. The Red Army seized Beijing, and Mao Zedong announced the formation of the People's Republic on October 1st, 1949, and the Soviet Union had just blown up its first atomic bomb, and the world was about to change. Now, in our next lecture, I'm going to go on to talk about Jiang Zemin's presidency, but as an introduction to that, we're going to go over what Deng Xiaoping did in the period when he was China's paramount leader from 1978 until 1992.